Okay. All right. How's everybody out there?
We just need to borrow your. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're on. Yeah.
All right. All right. Well, first of all, how about we give a big round of applause to everybody who just did that technical troubleshooting? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right. Okay. So, Marilyn, give me a thumbs up. I'm live. You can see my screen. Good. Okay. Let me go ahead and disconnect here from WebEx, and then we're going to showtime. Okay. Well, first of all, greetings to all of you B-Sides Calgary from New York City. I'm Carlos Diaz, otherwise known in the industry as Difference. And I am excited to be your last presentation. Please give me your energy and your attention. I'm privileged to represent CiscoSecure, which is my employer that I'm working with. And then essentially, I'm here to bring you not product. I'm not going to walk you through product. I'm here to give mind share in the spirit of B-Sides. For practitioners by practitioners, okay? So essentially, I'm going to provide you our philosophy on what we are preparing the defensive innovation for tomorrow, okay? A little bit about me. My name is Carlos. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. Formerly, I'm from the United States Navy, worked at places like Google and McAfee. My specialty is really to implement the productization of defensive products so we can contend or neutralize threats at global scale, okay? That's my Twitter handle. If you like code, go to my GitHub or feel free to chat with me. We can create tools, open source, and help each other out. And also be on the lookout for a lot of my posts on LinkedIn where I talk about defense, tactics, and how to neutralize adversaries, okay? So I'm bringing you this conversation today. It's about mindshare. It's about you, the defender, and how we definitely need to achieve defensive outcomes, okay? So first of all, you're probably wondering, what outcomes are we talking about when it relates to defense? And we're going to state the context first with the meaning, the purpose. I want to introduce to you in 2019, an authoritative company out there that is very good at what they do, known as McKinsey, introduced in the industry a new way of approaching cyber defense, and it's called the risk-based approach, okay? And the difference of the risk-based approach is that it's founded on being able to do three things really well. The first thing, it is fixing the fragmentation between the business alignment and the defenders down in the front line, being able to fix that misalignment that tends to be present in some organizations. And the reason why that's important is if the business doesn't align with us, the technical defenders, then we can never meet in the middle and purposely apply the investments that the company is providing. That's the first thing. The second thing that risk-based cybersecurity does is it changes the way we approach defending and designing controls in our enterprise. In other words, typically we tend to want to deploy controls all over our enterprise, and we feel that we're not reaching that mature state of defense because the controls aren't making it across the entire enterprise. Risk-based security changes that by allowing us to actually find what is the meaningful focus of specific controls in specific critical assets of the business so we can actually deal with the threats that target the most vulnerable areas of the enterprise. That's the difference between a maturity model versus a risk-based approach, right? And the third part is that this actually gives us a practical way to optimize defensive costs, okay? And we're going to see what that means a little bit further down the line. So I want you to really take this in, and after this presentation, go read this McKinsey article on risk-based cybersecurity, which is transformational. This is pretty much the premise that I want you to walk away with as a defender, your fellow defender. This is the value that this does for me in the enterprise because it allows me to rigorously prioritize and maximize the efforts as well as the investments that the company has afforded me by establishing an appetite for risk. In other words, our prioritization is improved because we don't have infinite resources. I'm sure you can relate to that. And then by establishing an appetite, me as a technical person, I help my organization establish what is intolerable for their appetite. An example here would be It is intolerable to lose productivity in the business. Yes, it is. So that being the focus of the high risk, then what is the actual threats that I need to be focused on primarily? Should it be pups, potentially unwanted software? Should it be crypto miners? Or should it be ransomware and privilege escalation? I want you to think about that. You got limited resources. Risk-based allows me to prioritize ransomware impact because that's where my appetite is. In other words, that's intolerable to lose productivity due to a ransomware attack. And if we continue to actually approach it that way, prioritizing rigorously, focusing on the meaningful threats that create impact and the controls that counteract it, then we're definitely in a position to spend our resources efficiently and effectively. So that's the biggest takeaway I want you to have here today. What does risk-based mean? It's not a compliance spreadsheet. It is a method of thinking of how to optimize the defensive layers each and every one of us has to design our security systems for. Okay, so that's risk-based cybersecurity. So initially, you're possibly thinking, it's like, is there a practical approach in order to achieve that risk-based cybersecurity approach? Yes. And I'd like to introduce you to something called TBS, Time-Based Security. Okay, so this would be the practical philosophy of how we can achieve effective risk-based cybersecurity. TBS was actually published in the 1990s by Mr. Win Schwartau, okay? And essentially, he and his team and some other luminaries intruded the Department of Defense's systems thousands of times, even though the Department of Defense's investments was massive. They had millions of dollars of IDSs, firewalls, etc. But Mr. Schwartau actually tested the defenses of all of those investments, how well the Department of Defense had prevention enabled, how well they could detect, and how would they respond after detecting. And that's known as the PD&R aspect of time-based security. Now, I want you to understand the cliff notes of time-based security. Time-based security is not about computing the amount of time an adversary takes to achieve their sequence. No. Time-based security is about how much time does an effective security system give you to respond and remove the threat. And time-based security is in our world everywhere. And this is an example of time-based security in the physical world of how buildings are designed. When you look at a door or a wall and the chemical composition of those particular elements, they are resistant against fires, which is the meaningful risk where loss of life could be established. So the time-based security metric that you're seeing there in those blue and green columns is letting anyone know if they position the walls and the door frames in a particular architectural pattern, how much time do those particular elements buy the people in such rooms until the fire spreads and there's loss of life. This is real world value. That's how buildings are built. Our homes are built. So TBS is not a theoretical aspect. It is a meaningful framework that tells us how to design an effective security system. And the formula that you're seeing there with the green smiley face, that's what every defender like you and me is aiming to design with our firewalls, our proxies, our endpoint security investments. And it tells us that when protection is greater than D plus R combined, then we have an effective security system. Notice what we're saying there. Prevention must be greater than the detection and response. In our example with the graphic, it means that the firewall, that the wall composition can sustain that fire enough time for people to know that there's a fire going on and they can walk out the building. In contrast, TBS tells us that an ineffective system is one whose prevention is less than detection and response combined. This is why it's important to know that if we're pursuing meaningful defensible outcomes, first we need to know what the final outcomes mean as the system that we're designing. And I'm going to give you one last example here of profiles of the systems that we're all building. And it's very natural. And I'm demonstrating to you three types of systems, three profiles. On the left-hand side, you're seeing system A. That is a TBS design system, one where prevention is greater than D plus R. That's an effective security system. In system B, you're possibly seeing is it's a system that is designed to detect most of the time, but there isn't much prevention, much response. And the outcome there shows us again with TBS, it's an ineffective security system. But why is it ineffective? It's because it's not giving you enough time to respond effectively. You're reacting too much. Now, if you have this type of system in your enterprise, then the only thing we need to understand is that if you have system B and C, you require a lot of humans to constantly respond effectively. And so we go back to the risk-based approach that's telling us optimizing the defensive layers. We don't have infinite resources. We want to be able to have enough prevention walls that give us enough time to respond efficiently with whatever resources we have in the enterprise. So TBS effectively gives us a way to understand that the defensive outcomes we design have to be manifested in the system that we're showing here in the green circle. Excellent. So time-based security is done. So if now we know how to design a system, then we need to ask ourselves, well, who actually does this kind of work? Okay. We're going to spend a little bit of time now enabling ourselves, the defender, because in order to get those outcomes done, the person that leads these outcomes is the defender, and they're on a journey to defend. In that journey, they have to be able to put together portfolios that have prevention controls, detection controls, and responsive controls. And essentially, if they can harmonize that, orchestrate it in a balanced approach, then they'll be able to prevent things to anticipate the adversary. They will be able to detect and identify the presence of the adversary confidently. And if and when they identify it, they'll be able to respond by confronting the adversary with the effective actions that are needed. And we're going to see an example here. I'm not just bringing you text. I'm going to get down to code and show you an example. Okay? So this effectively shows us that the outcomes of PD&R are driven by the defender in order to successfully defend. But let's talk about how does the defender actually achieve this? What is the essential things that they need? How are they approaching it mentally? And this slide will represent to you that no defender can successfully defend by using prevention technology or detection technology or response technology without having an understanding of the threat. It is impossible. If they don't have an understanding of the threat, all they see is isolated symptoms. But they need to have understanding in order to comprehend the systematic impact from the threats. If they have this understanding, then they can coordinate the technical interventions across their enterprise with IT that are required to defend. If they know how to coordinate after having an understanding, they can communicate and express the urgency and the severity by which the incident response needs to be conducted during the attack. They have the understanding, they can validate the threat intelligence and corroborate it to establish the credibility of the particular risk being manifested. This is the intimate relationship between the defender, context, and we're about to see the technology. The main thing for you to take away from this slide is defenders need to be provided concrete understanding so they can actually defend. And there's only one thing that improves understanding: context. And that's how outcomes are pursued, with context. I'd like to outline here why context is so important. Because context allows the defenders to actually make the first move, evaluate and understand where they're going to put their defenses against the adversary to degrade their impact. They take the right actions ahead of time. They're reacting less, and they're actually neutralizing high severity situations without those actually causing a lot of impact. But these actions that defenders take, what are they? Well, here's an example. You can have many products that are giving you the ability to create responsive actions. You can block things. You can restrict permissions. You can restore credentials. You can disable. Having a product that gives you these actions as capabilities is not enough to effectively defend. Because the most important thing to know is the capabilities that are afforded to you by a product, you must know when to use those things: before the attack, during the attack, or after the attack. And an example here would be if you restrict privileges. If you restrict privileges before the attack, then you're effectively reducing the attack surface. But if you're restricting privileges during the attack, then you're no longer proactive. You're actually reacting and conducting containment. That's the key here of this intimate relationship between context, technology, and expressiveness. How do we express an effective defensive plan? Let's get right into it now. Here's context and what it needs to be. Context has to be something that formulates the scenario, but it must introduce terms that allow defenders to understand the scenario and evaluate the scenario. And here's a day in the life of all of us. We're seeing here in the scenario these circles with question marks. That represents the discrete indicators that you're processing every day: hashes, IPs, registry keys, etc. You receive these on a daily basis. You don't always have context. You need a scenario in order to understand how those particular data points are actually intertwined. Now, with the scenario that we're seeing here with Visual Basic script macros, let's actually begin to explore terms that are needed from the scenario. And this is what you're most comfortably recognizing today in the industry, such as kill chains, MITRE ATT&CK, etc. We organize the same discrete data points with terms like initial access, execution, and persistence. But what are those things offering us? They're giving us understanding that there is a sequence in an attack. An attacker has to progress through particular objectives. And if we further look at the arrows of direction, they're letting us know what is the actual attack path that these data points are involved in. This effectively shows us that without context, it is nearly impossible to take effective actions with discrete data points. So what is the key takeaway now from context that is given us? Well, it's telling us one thing. Defenders, when they have a good understanding, they can characterize the threat. And if they can characterize it, they can express the actions to be taken against it. And if they can express those actions, then they will be logically able to conduct the actions to neutralize it. And that brings us into how do they evaluate those actions that they need to take? Here's the same progression, but this time we're going to add the security defenses that a defender has actually purchased in this particular area, okay? And these green shields represent products that have preventive capabilities. They can disrupt, they can block, they can neutralize things. And the blue shield represents passive technologies or capabilities. They just observe, they just detect, they're not capable of blocking. So with this very same attack sequence, the attacker could continue to come through, but the defender can now begin to evaluate how to take the first action. Perhaps with an application change control program, as we're seeing there, a defender can restrict which applications execute a particular types of files. In some organizations, maybe you don't have this ability to actually, enact such an action. Well, perhaps you have an antivirus or an EPP. And hopefully, if you have threat intelligence, then that particular product can disrupt item number 2. Okay. In some other areas, you may not be able to implement highly restrictive policies. Your organization might be more aggressive in blocking at the network layer with firewalls or proxies. Then in that situation, the proxy can interrupt. This doesn't represent the eradication of the threat, but it demonstrates that you're capable of disrupting the objective of the threat. Now, once you receive this, you kick in into your response mode and go back to the endpoints to neutralize items number 1 and 2. At a bare minimum, you must always, as a defender, have situational awareness. And that's what EDRs are really fantastic at. They can't block, but they can actually record. It's the equivalent of your surveillance camera being turned on, monitoring your house and its entry points. And then if we understand all these aspects, we can mix and match and combine flexibly the types of actions that it takes once we have the context about the scenario and we understand the terms or the characteristics of the threat. Okay, so I just saved all of you a lot of time studying defense in one slide, and I hope you appreciate this. But let's go a step further. It's one thing to have context and being able to understand threats. the defender has to, again, communicate and express their knowledge of these threats so that they can coordinate across the enterprise. And it's challenging to do that with stakeholders at the executive level or stakeholders at the tactical level or even peers who you're supposed to be working with in IT. It's a tough job. Well, I'm going to show you a way of how you can actually express these situations. And it always starts with a scenario hypothesis, right? And this is going to be exciting now for all of you that like code. So here's a hypothesis, right? A compiled executable achieves credential theft within memory. They're doing this with memory. So you might hear industry terms like fileless attacks, right? So credential theft within memory from a process in Windows called lsas.exe. And that results in unauthorized privilege use. In other words, the credentials that are stored in that process can be used across the enterprise because they're stolen, right? So this represents, back to McKinsey's risk-based cybersecurity, it is intolerable should you actually have attackers going throughout your environment in an unauthorized manner, impersonating your privileged users, okay? So we're tying those two together. Here's an example of a real-world threat. Yes, it's Mimikatz, but the importance is that the scenario accounts for any type of program that looks to achieve this by abusing LSAS. So here's the source code letting you know there's a Windows API system called open process. And this is the source code. So you actually can go use this awesome tool called code search. So you can see source code at scale from millions of repositories. But essentially, this is the code that is called a system call, open process. And then on the top, we're seeing SE debug. That is a very special privilege that allows programs to actually read the remote memory of another process, okay? As you walk the memory. You cannot achieve that without having that privilege and using this system call. Great. So this is a real world weapon. Let's actually see how to understand and characterize this weapon and express the defensive actions that are needed against this hypothesis. So we're going to introduce you to a structured thinking model, which is called the expressive threat capabilities model. I am an endpoint engineer here at Cisco and in other places where I've been. And I am representing to you the way my colleagues and I see the battlefield of an endpoint. This is the same for Linux, Mac, or Windows. This represents 13 specific dimensions inside of a computer system that an attacker must be able to abuse so that they can conduct an attack. Look at that visualization. It's extremely important to see that attackers have to work really hard. The myth that they can actually achieve things really well, they can only achieve things, one time of the percentage of their attacks, this is not true. This shows us that the defenders have immense abilities to disrupt attacks once it arrives in the computer system. So this effectively represents the attack capability progression. The more that an attacker can use one of these entities, the more intense the attacker will be. So that now brings us to the next point. We need a way to characterize or represent the offensive actions from the adversary. And we call those the intensity range. Naturally, if we have the intensity range representing the attacker, we need to represent ourselves as the defenders. We are in the counteract range. And in the counteract range, we represent the abilities or capabilities that a defender is capable of taking during the attack. So you probably have heard this in school, that every action causes an equal and opposite reaction. That's exactly the inspiration for this particular model. So let's see it in action practically. Back to the credential, theft binary. The first thing that the binary needs to do is execute. And by default of where it's executed, those dotted lines are showing you that the program that executes inherits the identity, the group that identity is assigned to, and the privilege that is assigned to that identity or group. But notice, most importantly, entity number 8, the system call, showed you open process. That's the first thing that needs to happen. If that program conducts the system call because it has the right privileges and it succeeds, then the program will be able to read the memory. And once they are in the memory, they can now begin to enumerate the running processes. They're walking in the memory neighborhood, knocking on doors in that neighborhood and saying, are you LSAS? Are you LSAS? When they find LSAS, now they'll begin to enumerate the credentials. So this hypothesis, as you're seeing it right there, effectively is represented from how the adversary designs their program in this manner that we're visualizing for you, okay? So the next part of how to use the expressive threat capabilities model is actually based on walking the attack, like here, execute, focusing on the number of the entity that is the highest, in this case, the system call, and you must take a defensive action. You must take a defensive action. As Carlos, an experienced defender, I'm going to take the restrictive action, and I'm going to try to apply it to the privilege, because if I remove that privilege, I know that the system call will not be successful. And here's an example of how to do it applied with native technology that we have in most of our environments. If you've never seen this particular GPO setting, it comes from the user rights assignments. And this is the default state in every single one of our enterprises. The privilege called, the rights assignment debug privileges by default is configured as it comes out of the box, enabling administrators to have this privilege. So one way to now restrict is to change the default administrators to the appropriate group that is allowed to do this type of deep technical troubleshooting, such as your service desk, or perhaps your enterprise admins. If you effectively change that setting, you have reduced the attack surface from any user that has admin rights and the general population significantly. In other words, leading us to know that the system call will not be successful by any program that chooses to do that. So if we do that, essentially, no one can walk the memory except the designated and approved staff, like technical escalation support staff, okay? So you keep using this model, you'll notice that in the read and enumerate, you can now use a less intensive approach of blocking or restricting things in your enterprise. You can now add a compensatory control, such as something like an EDR that detects things for you, so you can contextually enrich the investigation. And one approach that you can do it if you don't have an EDR is going back again to the native technology. And you can apply these three settings. Number one, start logging every single process that executes in your environment. Number two, add the command line arguments of process executable. But number three is the key. That is the gem of the visibility, the quality you're going to get. The adjust token privileges aspect, this tells you when SE debug is probably going to be used by any process that's executed. So just by doing that, you have successfully given yourself lots of visibility of processes that are attempting to do nefarious things in your enterprise. Very low cost. This brings us back to McKinsey when they talked about optimizing the defensive layers. I showed you two ways that if you don't have commercial products, you can do it straight with Active Directory and GPOs to start improving your particular situation in accordance to this hypothesis. Great. So this particular model now has told us where our defensive plan against this hypothesis is comprised of restricting and detecting. So let's double down on that. We said earlier that having the technological capabilities doesn't always allow us to know what is going to be the ultimate effect. So here I just want to highlight is the defender, once they have the capability, they must do this assessment in relation to the attack life cycle. That is before it happens, during its occurrence, and after it's happened. So if you apply these settings that I just talked about in the before you have this type of attack happen, then you're effectively being preventive, meaning you're proactive. But again, if you do this during the attack, you're no longer enjoying the proactivity of this. You're actually reacting and you're containing as you're going through the anxiety of an attack. So this table is mainly to emphasize is that having technological capability is insufficient to defend. You must know how to apply them for the particular outcome that you want to give to your organization. And if we put all of this together, what does this tell us? This tells us that technology must afford the defender a flexible and granular access. We want to block things, we want to restrict things, we want to interrupt, we want to disable, we want to observe, etc. We need technology to accommodate these very flexible needs because we have to formulate defensive plans. And the most important takeaway, defenders must have a way to evaluate when they're going to use this for the final outcome. So all in summary, this is telling us a couple of things. This is telling us that defending is basically rooted by having significant understanding. But even after you have significant understanding through context, defenders have to go through a massive effort in expressing how the threat manifests itself and how they're going to contend it so that they can conduct this enterprise-wide defense that the organization needs, right? So that covers our expressiveness. So we're almost done here. What are the key takeaways that you should have today from us, CiscoSecure, right? Risk-based security. It's going to allow for precision and pragmatic implementations. As you can see, I am a technical person. I didn't show you either pro or very in-depth debuggers today. No, today's session is not about that. But I can go in depth of designing technical interventions by thinking in risk-based approaches. We learned that time-based security is a fantastic framework that you should actually check out because it allows you to measure the effectiveness of your program. And this is important because if you're spending $5 million in prevention and another $5 million in detection, and perhaps you spend another $2 million in response, you're likely going to want to understand what is the value that is being derived from those investments. TBS can help you establish effective security system design. Okay. Next, we learned that defenders require context, but most importantly, context. It's not just context is king. It is the foundation of how we can effectively defend. Without it, we can take actions, but we don't know how effective our efforts will be. Last but not least, I want to emphasize that the role of technology as we're assessing tools, open source, commercial off the shelf, open cost, etc., we need granular and flexible usage of controls. Because as you just saw, depending on the attack's life cycle, whether it's before, during, or after, we may not be in a position to maximize our defensive action plans. So technology must accommodate that need of using technical controls in very flexible ways to control the environment, okay? And so with all of that said, I want to thank you, B-Sides Calgary. You're a very vibrant security community. I am out there on Twitter. I can be available anytime through LinkedIn. Hi, everyone.